Hi, my name is Melody Ju, and I'm an assistant professor in English here at UC Santa Barbara. And my talk for today is entitled Not to be Written but Absorbed, The World in 2050. In many ways, kelp was part of my childhood. I remember encountering these giant piles of rusty kelp that would wash up on the beach, and I would dodge swarms of sand fleas to go over and try to pop the tiny thumb-sized bladders that grew along each stem as if they were bubble wrap. In school, there was a kind of mythology built up around kelp forests as something huge but benign, maybe the closest we would get to kind of imagining a distinctly Californian cosmology of water deities. But it wasn't until recently that I experienced what it was like to dive into the ocean and visit kelp forests on their own terms, drifting back and forth with them in the cold tidal surge. The kelp forests inspire how I imagine the world in 2050, but perhaps not in the ways that you would think. I could have structured this talk around the question of what will happen to the kelp forest by 2050, but this question would place me at a distance from the kelp, observing it from afar, narrating a linear trajectory for what may befall the kelp with certain ocean warming trends and acidification. Instead, I want to think with the kelp, or to generate a kelp-oriented strategy for imagining the world in 2050. I want to think about the material metaphors that we use to imagine the future. By shifting from human beings who produce writing to kelp, which produce oxygen, I aim to show how the kelp inspire new material metaphors for how we imagine the future, a future not to be written or to be sedimented, but rather to be absorbed. My choice of the word inspire evokes the material and life-giving relationship between human beings and kelp. The etymology of the word inspire comes from a Latin root meaning to breathe, and it is well known that marine algae, of which kelp is one type, produce at least 70 to 80% of the oxygen in the atmosphere. 70 to 80%. To put that in perspective, if you breathe 5 times, the oxygen from 4 of your breaths comes from marine plants. It's no wonder then that scientists like Sylvia Earle have called the ocean the blue lungs of the planet and urged us to take care of the ocean's plant ecologies as if we want to continue to breathe. But the ocean as lungs is interesting as a figure to think with. By imagining the ocean as a kind of organ, Sylvia Earle's analogy evokes a kind of distributed concept of human embodiment, inclusive of the ocean. Our continued existence requires other environments and other life forms, a point made by scholars like Donna Haraway, Anna Tsing, Lynn Margulis, and others. The respiration relationship between marine plants and human beings encourages us to look for other examples of what we might call ecologies of absorption. The poetics of this phrase, emphasizing fluidity, is distinct from the discourse emerging around the Anthropocene today. The Anthropocene circulates as an umbrella concept for imagining a variety of changes to the climate that will eventually become inscribed in the geologic record. Although it has been taken to account for changes in the atmosphere and oceans as well as the land, this definition is anchored in the field of geology, of being able to mark a golden spike of human activity registered somewhere in the stratigraphic layers of the Earth. Projects like Making the Geologic Now aim to surprise us by changing a past-oriented discipline like geology to a present-oriented conscientiousness about the geologic layers being created right now. As much as I value the importance of such projects, I cannot help but notice a certain terrestrial bias in the way that we speak about the future to come, where the strata are in the foreground and the ocean recedes to the background. Instead, let's think about a few major anthropogenic changes happening right now that are difficult to describe in terms of a future being written, ocean acidification, and global warming. Ocean acidification, called climate change's evil twin sometimes, is arguably an anthropogenic process. The ocean absorbs much of the carbon dioxide that we put into the atmosphere with fossil fuel emissions to produce carbonic acid. as carbonic acid accumulates over time, the pH of the seawater, which is slightly basic to start with, will continue to decrease, posing a huge threat to marine organisms that have shells, which include crustaceans, corals, and certain plankton. This is not a process of writing, I argue, but rather absorption, involving erasure and disintegration. If it proceeds unchecked, we will only see the effects of ocean acidification in the geologic record as a certain absence of shell-making animals. But the lesson here is that the ocean breathes what we produce just as we breathe what the kelp produces. Another process that is hard to describe as writing is the ocean's absorption of heat. Much of the excess heat produced by greenhouse gases accumulating in the atmosphere is also absorbed by the ocean. Yet this formulation is also interesting, I think, because heat is not a substance per se. It's the quantity of energy transferred between two bodies. So in this way, you can say that the ocean stores heat, but you can't say that the ocean is inscribed with heat, which implies a kind of mark, which implied by the term inscription. But like ocean acidification, ocean warming, which will drive more powerful hurricanes, the El Nino effect, and even coral reef bleachings we're seeing in Australia today, it's hard to imagine in terms of something being written in the stratigraphic record, although maybe it could be inferred by an absence of marine organisms that would normally be there in abundance. So what I'm hoping that you notice in these examples is that each of the phenomena I describe evokes what Gaston Bachelard has called the material imagination of matter, or the way that our figurative language shifts according to what kind of substance we're talking about, whether it's oceans, air, or earth. The way that we speak about the future coming into being thus always involves a particular imagination of matter or of media. Ocean acidification and warming are phenomena that a kind of writing metaphor does not adequately account for, and I think it makes more sense to view these changes as matters of absorption rather than as a kind of new geologic layer being deposited or a written record. So if we imagine the future from the position of the kelp, we have to think about not only what we are absorbing from the kelp, the fresh air, but also what the kelp and the ocean are absorbing from us. The future yet to be written feels to me qualitatively different from the future to be absorbed. The future to be written may include me, but when I think of it this way, it feels like a text that is separate from my body, something that I might observe from a distance. I might be an agent in making inscriptions on such a text, but I'm still apart from it. Changing the metaphor from writing to absorbing the future emphasizes vulnerability and the way that human beings are not separate from the changes that are in process right now. Absorption helps direct our attention beyond kelp to other environmental justice concerns, like the issue of air quality as arises in Chai Jing's documentary Under the Dome, or to issues of flooding and sea level rise for island nations and coastal states like Louisiana. Absorption as a concept addresses the way that so many of these environmental changes will slowly creep up on us, accumulating, eroding, erasing, and changing. This is not to bemoan a lost state of equilibrium exactly, but rather to emphasize the importance of developing a way of speaking about changes that is adequate to the materiality that they have. So as I dive into the kelp forest, drawing breath from the compressed air of my scuba tanks and looking up at the slippery threads of kelp reaching up to the sky, I think about what kind of ethical obligations my scholarly community would feel if we spoke about the world in 2050 not to be written, but to be absorbed. Thank you.